and geologist Steve Hammond from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are the chief scientists on this expedition. They are on a mission, backed by the National Science Foundation and NOAA, a mission to explore a mystery that began a generation ago. In February of 1977, National Geographic Explorer-in-Residence Bob Ballard and a team of scientists were sailing off the Galapagos Islands when they spotted them. Hydrothermal vents, and all around them, alien creatures the likes of which had never been seen.
We had thought prior to that discovery that all life is basically in the sun through the process of photosynthesis. That the sun was the life-giving power to Earth. Well, here was a system that was living independently, living in total darkness, not drawing its energy from the sun, but from the Earth itself, through a process we now call chemosynthesis.
In chemosynthesis, bacteria absorb chemicals in the vent water to make organic carbon, or food.
The discovery of these ecosystems in the hydrothermal vents was very important because it told us that life can thrive, not just grow a little bit, but actually thrive in the absence of life.
This initial encounter with this new exotic world was not enough. Ballard and others would come back to the Galapagos again 2 years later in 1979. This time they found a vent neighborhood, more abundant than the first. They called it the Rose Garden. Scientists believe the only way to really understand these alien worlds is to visit them again and again.
Imagine if you just saw a winter time somewhere and you saw trees without leaves, right? And you came back a year later in wintertime and you saw trees without leaves, you would say, trees never have leaves, right? But if you come back in the spring and in the summer and in the fall, you'll see that these things become full of leaves, the leaves change and then they fall off, and there's a dynamic biological process that goes on, and it's that sense of understanding that we have yet to have at vets, understanding of animals, and that's what we have to do.
Okay, so these hydrothermal, why am I showing you a video on hydrothermal vents? Because this is, again, one of the ideas that people have for how life arose. And so maybe, instead of warm little ponds on the surface of Earth, maybe the first life arose from organisms in these hydrothermal vents. So that's one of the theories that people have. And so again, if life originated on Earth, then where? So Darwin and the warm little pond theory, hydrothermal vents. There's some evidence for the hydrothermal vents. There's a paper that was written recently targeted 355 genes that they think originated with the last universal common ancestor, which is basically the farthest we can go back to find an ancestor that was the precursor to all living things on Earth, all bacteria, all archaea, all eukaryotes. And when you look at these 355 genes, they point to deep sea vents. So this paper suggested that the Luca was maybe a deep sea vent organism. So that's pretty interesting, right? All right, so if you want, there's some other videos here on hydrothermal vents. One of these, this one, is just beautiful. It's in high def, and it's just music playing to these gorgeous hydrothermal vents under the ocean. So I know you have lots of free time, but it's kind of fun to watch. All right, I'm going to just show you the first part of it. This is another very recent, the last thing I showed you said, no, it was probably hydrothermal vents. Now I'm going to show you another recent piece of science that says, no, it was warm little ponds. Just to keep things really.
Mathematical modeling can seem like maybe a dry profession, but when you get to pull in findings from a half dozen different fields, the results can be especially awesome. Like a paper published this week by a team of scientists in Canada and Germany confirming a piece of speculation going all the way back to Darwin. This research suggests that the Earth's biochemistry could have originated in warm ponds on newly formed continents between 4.5 and 3.7 billion years ago, with the help of meteor strikes that used to rock the planet. And it supports the hypothesis that the earliest biochemical processes centered around ribonucleic acid, or RNA. For this paper, the team constructed a detailed mathematical model of the conditions of early Earth and filled that model with small ponds. The ponds were small enough that they would sometimes dry out in seasonal cycles. Their models accounted for meteorites supplying some raw materials for chemical reactions, like nucleobases, which are some of the building blocks of DNA and RNA. Previous research has found that nucleobases can actually be formed in space, and we've found them in meteorites before. But for those nucleobases to do anything life-wise, they have to come together in a chemical chain, or polymer. The team's model found that if the ponds were able to dry out periodically, the evaporation and precipitation cycles created the right conditions for RNA polymers to form and remain fairly stable. Other lab studies have suggested that a hot and dry step could concentrate the ingredients and encourage the reactions that form the polymer bonds, and then adding water gives everything a good mix to bring in more chemical components. In cells like ours, RNA acts as a go-between for DNA and protein. Plus, it makes up some of the most ancient cellular structures, like ribosomes. So some researchers hypothesize that RNA used to fulfill the roles of genetic code and biological machinery until more stable, more flexible DNA and protein took on those jobs. This team pieced together prior research from fields as diverse as chemistry and astrophysics to do a calculation no one's ever done before about the state of the early Earth, although these ideas have been floating around for a while. The phrase warm little pond was actually coined by Charles Darwin, who imagined a place with plenty of nutrients and energy for the chemical origins of life. And while Darwin was no biochemist, the idea has held up. In recent decades, some have argued that deep-sea hydrothermal vents are a more likely place for the origin of life than ponds at the surface. But this study suggests that those wet and dry cycles are essential to form RNA polymers, so it couldn't happen at the bottom of the ocean. And Darwin's delightful phrase continues to bear scientific weight. A much more modern biochemistry.
Okay, so remember last time we were talking about spontaneous generation versus biogenesis and how scientists argued about it? So do you see that we still have these arguments today, right? Warm little pond versus hydrothermal vents? Kind of cool, right? Scientists are still trying to sort out things that they don't understand. This video has a third idea. So let's go ahead and watch this one, just in case 2 wasn't enough for you.
When we talk about the search for life elsewhere in the universe, we almost always talk about it in terms of where. Like where other habitable planets might be, and how far they are from their stars, and whether we could ever reach them. All that stuff is fun to think about. But some scientists are investigating the issue of extraterrestrial life by asking a different question. When? Because even if life has developed on other planets, it may not have shown up at the same time as it did here. Let's start with what we know. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And the fossil record shows that the first hints of simple single-celled organisms appear around 3.7 billion years ago. Over time, life forms became increasingly complex, with the first signs of multicellular organisms showing up in fossils that are around 1 billion years old. Since then, life has grown in complexity at an exponential rate, creating the diversity that we see today. In fact, a pair of theoretical biologists, Alexei Shadov and Richard Gordon, recently calculated that the genetic complexity on Earth has been doubling every 376 million years. That means that today, there's twice as much unique information encoded in the genomes of living things as there was 376 million years ago, and 4 times more than 752 million years ago, and so on. And this got the scientists to wondering, what if they extrapolated their trend backward? If the genetics of living things doubled in complexity every 376 million years, then when would the very first, simplest form of life have appeared? Much to their surprise, they found that, mathematically speaking, the first genetic ancestor to all life on Earth should have existed 9.5 billion years ago. 5 billion years before Earth actually formed. Now, the scientists point out that there are explanations for this. Like, it's possible that life on Earth grew more complex more quickly in the past than it does now, which would account for their results. But still, it raises the question, what if life, as a thing, in the universe, is older than our planet itself? Sharov and Gordon aren't the only ones thinking about when life began. Astrophysicist Avi Loeb recently calculated that what we think of as the general formula for life, liquid water, chemical compounds like methane and ammonia, and a rocky planet to serve as the cosmic mixing bowl, could have all formed more than 13.5 billion years ago, as early as 10 million years after the Big Bang. At that point in time, Loeb figures there were probably some planets, most likely rogue planets, not bound to any star, formed from the cast-off debris from the very earliest stars in the universe that had already exploded. And those planets wouldn't have even needed nice balmy orbits around a friendly star to get the spark of life out of their chemical mixtures. That's because the universe started off extremely hot and has been cooling ever since. So at some point, he says, the average temperature of the universe was in the right range for those rogue planets to have liquid water on their surface. Nutty, I know. But studies like these suggest that life could be older than we think, and that it could naturally spread from place to place around the universe, a theory known as panspermia. According to this theory, impacts could blast material off the surface of a planet, and that debris could carry with it the ingredients for life. And if it kicked out fast enough, some of that material could eventually end up on other planets. In this scenario, simple components of life from rogue planets could have been mixed in with the material that our solar system formed from billions of years ago. So, I'm not saying it's aliens. No, seriously people, I'm not saying that life on Earth was brought here by aliens. What I'm saying is that panspermia is one potential explanation for why the trends of genetic complexity that we see suggest that life on Earth could be older than the planet itself. Now, this theory doesn't explain where those components came from in the first place, and it doesn't mean that life is necessarily abundant in the universe, because the seed still needs to find fertile soil in order to sprout, right? So it could still be that life we have here on Earth is rare, maybe even unique within our larger celestial neighborhood. What these new studies suggest is just that the best question may not be, are we alone in the universe? It may be more like, are we the first advanced life in the universe? Or are we just the most recent link in a chain of life that dates back to the early universe? Thanks for joining me.
Pretty cool, right? Your head can go, oh, so it's sort of really amazing that, and it makes sense though, right? That all of, in the early universe, everything was really warm. And so there could have been lots of liquid water, and life could have actually started forming then. And when you think about how genetic change occurs, which we're about to discuss in evolution, that really we would have predicted that life would have started a lot more, a lot older, a lot further back than just the age of the Earth itself. All right, so there you go. 3 competing hypotheses for how life showed up on Earth in the first place. All right, so we've been speculating for 15, 20 minutes now. So now we're going to talk about the science that we have, the cold, hard science that actually exists. We do have evidence for early life. So when we say that we have evidence that that life has been on Earth for about 3.5 billion years, that comes from things like the fossil record. And there are fossils of bacteria that I will show you in a minute. We can also look at the geological record, because once life showed up on Earth, the presence of life changed the geology. So for example, iron that was reduced in a reduced form on early Earth became oxidized as living things began putting oxygen onto the planet. Again, we showed some data earlier that you can recreate the early environment of the Earth and show that just the conditions on early Earth resulted in a change in the biochemistry. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about fossils here. So the first microorganisms were likely the precursors to things like cyanobacteria. Some of the first evidence we have are these structures called stromatolites. And the reason we know what these are is because stromatolites exist now. Bacteria often grow, we think of them as individuals, but they often grow in films that we call biofilms. When you have a biofilm of bacteria, it'll trap minerals between the different layers. And so what you see in these fossilized structures isn't the bacteria, but it's the minerals, but they're trapped, and they were kind of deposited in between these layers of bacteria. And so you can see the layering here in the geology. And again, we can see stromatolites now, that aren't 3.5 billion years old, so we recognize them when we see the fossils of them. There is electron micrographs. When you just look at rocks, sometimes you see structures that look like fossilized bacteria. They don't really look like the rock that they're in. So this is 3.45 billion-year-old rocks from South Africa, and it looks like there may be structures there that are consistent with an ancient bacillus. It's easy to find fossils of cyanobacteria, so this is 3.5 billion years from Western Australia. And we can compare these to cyanobacteria today. Here's a cyanobacteria, and here are some fossilized cyanobacteria. So we're pretty confident that's what we're looking at. And so these would be bacteria. You can date the rock and figure out how long these organisms have been on Earth. So we have a good confidence in living things being here 3.5 billion years ago. How they got here, though, as I point out, there's lots of debate about. Okay, so I got a clicker question for you. I've actually already told you the answer to this, so let's see if you remember what I said. All right, so 38 people have clicked in. I was hoping to get back to 47 or higher. All right. See what you guys said. And that is the correct answer. All right, so the oxygen gas that was on Earth was not produced until there were photosynthetic organisms. And up until last semester, I always said that the first oxygen was produced by cyanobacteria 2.7 billion years ago, and then I saw this article in Science Daily in March of this year. And so photosynthesis may have originated 1 billion years earlier than we thought, according to a study. And so they might not have been cyanobacteria, they may have been the precursors to cyanobacteria, and they may have actually been even a smaller, more ancient organism. And they care about this because, again, we look at when oxygen showed up in the geological record to help us understand when life originated. It turns out, though, that when you think about oxygen in the atmosphere, this is a little bit like global warming. You know, the Earth's been warming up. A lot of that heat has ended up trapped in the oceans, and so the oceans are warming, but we maybe don't notice it as much on the surface of the Earth. When the first organisms started producing oxygen, a lot of that oxygen just got absorbed by the iron and the other minerals. They just became oxidized, so the atmospheric oxygen didn't actually increase because the Earth was acting kind of like a sponge and absorbing all that atmospheric oxygen. And so there's interest in knowing exactly when oxygen started being produced. One of the things that you should know about oxygen is that it's a fairly toxic molecule. In another couple of weeks, when we start talking about growth and nutrition of microbes, we're going to talk about oxygen. There are anaerobic bacteria that live on Earth today that actually are poisoned. If you add oxygen, they can't survive. Oxygen is a fairly reactive molecule. It can form free radicals that attack the molecules that are in the cells and damage them pretty fast. And so the first cells that evolved on Earth or showed up on Earth actually evolved in an anaerobic environment. There was very little atmospheric oxygen. As oxygen started getting produced, this is the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's a log chart, so this is where we are today, 20%. As this happened, it began to increase. What we saw was actually something called the Great Oxygen Catastrophe. One of the first extinctions on Earth was 90% of the organisms dying because they couldn't tolerate all the oxygen that was in the air. Now, that seems crazy to us because we can't survive without oxygen, right? But early organisms were poisoned by oxygen. And organisms like you that need oxygen to survive have taken advantage of how reactive it is to actually get more energy from fuel by using oxygen as a reactant in our metabolism. But early organisms were just poisoned by oxygen, and a lot of them didn't survive. So you see that there was a little dip, really, in survival, and then it took off again as organisms adapted to the presence of oxygen. This is a cute little cartoon. The two cyanobacteria, of course, that's not what they look like, but they're talking to each other. They say, I think it's arrogant that we think as cyanobacteria that we can somehow change the climate of the whole Earth. Right? And yet these little bacteria totally change the climate, right? Here we have representatives in Congress. I think it's arrogant that we think as people we can somehow change the climate of the whole Earth. Give these people a science class. It'd be really nice to be elected to Congress. You had to take some basic biology or chemistry. I'll take any science. All right, another provocative question for you as we start to talk about evolution here. Charles Darwin was an atheist. Oh boy, nobody wants to answer this. It's true, false. Let's see what you guys are saying. 50-50. Yeah, very funny. All right. So it's kind of funny because I think that there's a misconception about some of the early scientists like Darwin, that maybe he was an atheist and that's why he came up with this theory. But actually Darwin was, like most wealthy, educated people, he was actually training to become a minister. And so that was his background. You know, people who, the people who had the most free time to do science, we talked about this with Leeuwenhoek, they tended to be people who got a lot of money and free time, right? If you were lucky enough to get an education, that probably meant you were from a wealthy family. And most of the institutions doing the educating were actually part of the church. So Darwin, like many in his era, actually started off with a very religious education and upbringing, time when he became a minister. And he ended up traveling the world and coming up with this, becoming a scientist and coming up with ideas. But it was never in opposition to church teaching. So he was a very religious man. Towards the end of his life, people who interviewed him felt like his beliefs had shifted, where he went from being very, very religious to being a little bit more agnostic. And when I say agnostic, I mean more that he understood more at the end of his life how much we don't know from all of his studies. And so he was a little bit more open to different possibilities as he got older. But one of the things that I always like to say is there is no requirement that you either, see things through a scientific lens or that your religion, they can coexist. And there are many scientists that are great scientists that are very spiritual and also very, very competent scientists. And so I would put Charles Darwin in that category. But it's kind of a fun question to ask and talk about. All right, so before we do our disease of the day, let's talk a little bit about evolution and get at least through this part of these slides, and what we don't finish, we'll finish next time. One of the early clearer questions was evolution explains life on Earth. And so people tend to think evolution life, and so that must be the right answer. But actually, as I said earlier, this only explains how the first living things have evolved to be all of the organisms on Earth today and all of the organisms that ever existed, since most organisms that ever existed on Earth are extinct. So what's here now is what's left, what survived all the extinctions that happened, and there's been many over the course of Earth's history. We do know that all living things have a common ancestor, so we can actually use DNA sequencing to go back and identify that last universal common ancestor that we know was the precursor to all living things on Earth. As things reproduce, mistakes are made, changes are made in the DNA. So every time a bacteria divides, the two bacteria, that little changes accumulate in those bacteria. They become more and more different as they divide. So it starts out as one organism and it divides into two and then into four and then into 8. And after a while, these bacteria all have little differences in their genetics. And sometimes those differences don't have any impact on the bacteria. They grow and divide and do everything the same, even though there's little changes. Sometimes a change happens and it's detrimental. In fact, most changes are probably either neutral or detrimental. They result in the organism doing less well than it's, and they die off because they are not as well adapted. Once in a while, very rarely, a modification gives that descendant organism an advantage. And now it can divide and reproduce better than its siblings. And it will do better. And because it's dividing and reproducing more efficiently, it will actually have a chance to pass that new trait on. And pretty soon, over billions of years. That makes sense. But you get the idea that over time, right? You have all these changes and you have all these different organisms that have evolved. So we ended up with billions of years. We have this natural selection, being the idea that traits that are advantageous, that allow you to reproduce and pass your DNA on, are selected for. And that has allowed humans, at least, to, we are so well adapted that we can live anywhere on Earth just about. I can't dunk you in a hot spring. There are bacteria that are better adapted to that. But the coldest and the hottest parts of Earth, we can build shelter and air conditioners and clothing, and we are really well adapted to Earth. And a lot of that has to do because we have large creative brains that when we use them to solve problems, we do really well. All right. So there's two parts of evolutionary theory that you need to sort of understand as we move forward for micro to be meaningful, I think. One is that over time, there's a randomness to the change in genetics. If your children end up being better looking than you and your partner, then it may be random genetic change, that they just have some genes that are different, that as you reproduce, there were some mutations that occur. We call these de novo mutations. That change, that your offspring, even though they're your kids, they're going to have some DNA differences that are completely different than yours because changes were made as the egg and the sperm were produced. So that's random. What's not random is what traits are selected for, because that's determined by the environment. So I just kind of want to take two different environments here. Here's a polar bear, right? And how would the polar bear do in the desert? It wouldn't do well at all. It would probably die really fast, right? Because what's not random is the environment that selects for which traits are advantageous. Over billions of years of evolution, organisms that live in really cold environments become the traits that allow them to survive are selected for. So polar bears have black skin. They have clear fur, so the light can get in. The black skin absorbs the light, the energy, to help them stay warm. And the fur doesn't block that. They look white, but they're actually, if you look at their skin underneath, it's black. They have big, thick coats. The organisms that are there are white in order to not get eaten by the polar bears, right? They don't stand out against the snow as much. If you look at the desert, the really different traits have been selected for. So you have animals with really big ears with blood vessels close to the surface to help them cool off. They're out at night, but not during the day, so they can burrow in their dens and stay cooler. You've got plants that can exist without rain for months and months at a time. All right, what's not random is the environment determines what changes in the DNA are advantageous and what are detrimental. The environment is what makes that determination. All right? The changes are random, but what determines if they're good or bad or neutral is the environment. All right, so 3 types of mutations. There are beneficial mutations, which are rare. There are neutral mutations, changes in the DNA. Those are common. And there are detrimental changes in the DNA. These are also common. Okay. But you're lucky if it's beneficial, because most of the time, when a mistake happens, when there's a change in the DNA, most of the time that ends up having a negative impact on the organism. Okay. So we'll start with this overview next time and work our way through the rest of these slides, and then we will do our review of macromolecules next time. Okay? But what I want to do now is go to disease of the day and talk about the plague. This is a good one. All right. All right. So we don't worry too much about the plague these days. But it's one of those gruesome epidemics that's kind of fun to talk about. These days, antibiotics take care of the plague. You get infected with the plague, which you can do because there are animals that are vectors for the plague. You can absolutely get infected with it. These days, there are good antibiotics. If you get treated soon enough, you're going to be fine. However, in Europe, in particular, there's been multiple plagues. It started in, I think, Bangladesh was the very first cases, and they migrated as people began with a great shipping lane. When people first began going from continent to continent, the plague was a really great bacterium. It can go back and forth between rodents and fleas. So the rodents would jump on the ship with the fleas, and then they'd be taken to the next continent, and then the rats would get off, and the fleas can bite people, and the rats reproduce, and more fleas. Anyway, it was able to travel all over the world from humans, carried it on their ships. So the organism that causes the plague is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The person who discovered it is Alexandre Yersin. So this is back when it was okay to name things after yourself. It's not cool to do that now, but it used to be. So Yersinia pestis, it's a gram-negative rod, so it's kind of this rod-shaped psilus. And it lives in the guts of fleas, and so fleas will transmit it to rodents. And of course, fleas can bite people and also transmit it to people as well. So you can get the plague in the United States. People get the plague every year. It actually is in nature all the time, so there's a cycle between rodents in the environment and fleas. And so it just kind of cycles back and forth in these two populations. Once in a while, there's an outbreak where a lot of rodents die, and if that's the case and there's animals nearby, sometimes those fleas will jump on cats and dogs. Cats usually get very ill, dogs not so much. And this is true people too. Sometimes people don't get that sick from an illness that kills someone else, that happens. But if your animal gets sick from the plague, a cat, for example, might cough and spray droplets of the plague, and you can breathe those in, and you can get plague in your lungs, which is called pneumonic plague. Or the animal has fleas, and the fleas bite you, and you can end up with bubonic plague, where the plague bacterium ends up causing the black swelling of the lymph nodes. So here's Alexandre Yersin. He's an interesting guy. Traveled all over the world. Competed with a Japanese scientist who'd been brought to Hong Kong to try to identify the causative organism. This is about the time that Koch was discovering the causes of TB and cholera and a few of these other sort of plaguey diseases. And so, anyway, there was a big scientific competition between Alexandre and this Japanese scientist who was very highly regarded in Hong Kong to try to identify the source of the plague. And the people in Hong Kong didn't want him there. They wouldn't give him any lab space. And they think it was actually because of some of the heart conditions he had to deal with. He kind of accidentally stumbled on it. But he's sort of famous for discovering the plague. So actually, I said Bangladesh, but I think I'm thinking of cholera. Originated in China, spread along the trade routes to Constantinople, then Europe. 30 to 60% of Europeans died in the 14th century of the plague, so 50 million people. Right? That's really a lot of people. Up to 60%, so basically half the people died in Europe from the plague. There have been modern plagues, so the one in 1860 was the one in Hong Kong that they began to study to try to identify the cause. And then there's been other plagues that are more modern as well. So Alexandre Yersin was a student of Louis Pasteur. It's kind of just trying to get the sheer number of people who die from the plague. There are these plague cottages all over London. So if you go, you can read, it'll have a cottage, it'll talk about all the people who died of the plague. So this is a list of this is all together, including your in-laws. She lost 25 relatives. She was the sole survivor in her household. When you go to London, if you're going to build in London, which people do all the time, right? You have to get archaeological permits. Because anytime you go down, there's burial sites. I mean, London is just layer upon layer of ancient civilizations. And so anywhere they're digging, you'll see the archaeologists are there, and they're collecting the bones and things like this. So they're trying to build something here, but now the archaeologists have stepped in because they found the burial ground. So many people died of the plague, they were just dumping them into mass graves. When you find these mass graves, they're very frequently plague victims. And they can date them. They've actually